Really cool experience this past week. I happened to be in Seattle and I went to the Museum of Flight. And I'll just add that if you're ever out in the Seattle area, you need to go there. That place is super dope, as the youngsters say these days. And it would be, I have a couple of youngsters that I'm not even sure they use that word, but I'm an old guy. I actually like to use that word once in a while. And so we are recording part 2 of a 2-part Joe Bros with no external guest series today, right, Eric, on how one might use intelligence and intelligence doctrine to conduct some recession planning. And last time we gathered, we touched on, arguably a bit of a rushed format. We touched on 5 areas: win-loss in a recessionary environment versus a growth market, how supply chain fragility and forecasts around resilience of supply chain needs to be reconsidered, how understanding how pricing affects profitability in elevated cost of capital environments, how talent priorities change during a recession, and are there any vulnerable acquisition candidates that we can acquire at a bargain over the next 18 months? We kind of filled those in quickly, and I think our plan for today, acknowledging that we were a little bit rushed on some of them, and I see your post there, Suki. They might not use the word dope in the UK, but at least here in Wisco, I'm going to stick with it. We'll have a good laugh about that sometime soon, I know.
Perfect.
What do you think about last week's discussion, big brother?
I thought it was a good way to get started and to sort of pick the low-hanging fruit a little bit. And as we discussed earlier, we're going to use a little bit of a different structure to organize our thoughts today. And I'm just going to share screen here quick and corner us a little by saying the traditional doctrine that comes out of the competitive intelligence world is known as key intelligence topics and questions. And these are a few examples of what a key intelligence question might look like across the 3 different protocol domains. And the instrument that we're going to use for our little analysis here during Unthinkable, and I'll tell you about the POAPs here in a second, is that we're going to linger on each of these 3 for about 8 minutes or so. So questions from the audience. We need interlocutors for the second half. We've already got a couple picked out. So for those of you who volunteered already, thank you. That's wonderful. You're getting the idea, audience. And we will also be turning us over to you here in the second half. But before we do that, the key intelligence topics and questions system was adapted by Jan Herring to the competitive intelligence mission starting at Motorola in the 1980s to allow for a little bit more organization. Thank you, Terry. Appreciate the volunteer. And allow for a little more organization. Derek, I know you've taught a lot on this subject. The thing that struck me about kits was I saw it actually showing up in a different place, and that was in Clay Christensen's material, which is right here. And I adapted some of these ideas from Christensen's work to describe and align with what I think key intelligence topics was really doing, which was, excuse me, showing us that there are really 3 domains that we need to keep our eye on as an intelligence analyst: signals of change in the macro environment, our own strategic choices, and then how things are going to turn out for us in the marketplace. And of course, some of you may recognize that we've now interpreted that as this process of moving insights to action. And I'll give you a little higher resolution view of this right here. And I'll just leave this on screen for a couple of seconds and pass it back to you, Derek. I just got a frog in my throat. I got to go get a drink of water. Derek, can you hold the mic for just a second so I can clear my throat? And obviously, discovery optimality simulation is how we've sort of reinterpreted this in our world.
Mm-hmm. I want to second Jim Miller's comment out there about having an international crowd. We have quite an international crowd going on here. I don't know this doctrine like Eric does, everybody, but the adaptation of national intelligence topics, what Jan Herring and a whole bunch of other far smarter people than myself did within the government apparatus years and years, if not decades and decades ago, to get to that point where kits, key intelligence topics, had been adopted within the corporate landscape of competitive and market intelligence was something that was even still an ongoing process when I joined this industry in 2003. And Eric, I think as we were working on yet another book chapter outline last week, Wednesday or Tuesday, maybe it was, due to some work travel that I had, we were talking about that adaptation and a conversation you had with Jan at probably the 2015 CI Fellows induction meeting. I'm going to guess that happened in Chicago when I was inducted amongst some of my great fellows, Zine Applebaum and Cynthia Chen Correa that year. And you were talking with Jan, I believe it was at that meeting, about things that we ultimately control the decision of, strategic decisions, aligning to that kit number one, strategic decisions. Then the second one would be key players, or looking at that from the standpoint of somebody else has control over that. That's a influence factor at best. From the standpoint of your competitor is going to have more superiority over that choice coming to fruition for them. And then things that nobody has control over. Those early warning signals. That are just going to happen. You can predict that they might happen within a 100-year time frame, like what we've talked about on this podcast before, but you can't necessarily predict when. And what I like about this is that you've taken that next step of aligning control factor theory, the old kit protocols, to control factor theory through the lens of discovery, optimality, and simulation in this regard. So if that frog's out of your throat, I know our audience would love to hear a little bit more about that from you.
Yeah, forgive me for that, everybody. And Derek, thank you for taking the wheel there for a second, because I actually couldn't talk without choking. So the idea is that intelligence should be there to help us anticipate market opportunities, respond to those market opportunities before the competitors do, and then ultimately have financial results that are alpha in comparison with our peer group. Meaning a higher performing financial posture. And that's ultimately the value proposition of intelligence in the end. All intelligence programs, whether you like it or not, are going to get judged on whether or not they performed from a financial standpoint. And in the long run, that's a predictable activity. So all we were trying to do there really was to make that a little more clear. And so, Derek, I thought today maybe we could take these one at a time and kind of step through each of these stages. That there are macro environmental control factors that, if you were to use the steepled acronym, and social, technological, economic, ecological, legal, political, ethical, and demographic, those 8 domains of macro environmental definition, it allows you to put some boundaries around your operating environment that now makes it possible for you to align your offer to that market and the superiority criteria that market will reward with share. So that's number one. We'll linger on that for a second. Number two, optimality really means making sure that you have perfect alignment between your offer and that superiority criteria in the form of an investment grade conjecture. Maybe I'll throw this back up on the screen so you guys can see some of this nomenclature that's a little more abstract. The form of the investment grade conjecture that ultimately will decide whether or not you get funded. The product of optimality, in other words, is basically your strategy. Here's how we're going to go take share and carve out territory within our designated macro environment. And then finally, simulation, which is most easily described for us in the context of wargaming. And so it takes those contingency control factors that everybody's going to have to cope with. The optimality stage looks at dominion control factors that largely are within your power as an actor. And then finally, it tests them against the interests of other stakeholders who might win or lose, those who might help or hinder you. And then from that, your final product is now the actionable esteem, as we've started calling it, which is held in high regard by its co-authors. In other words, because this is a team sport, this is not an individual solo activity. This is something you do with the rest of your planning team. Everyone has a tremendous degree of confidence in ultimately that the conjecture has been tested, and that the investment that had been asked for is something that they really do see as fundable, something where you have a pretty guaranteed return, and it's safe. It's safe for them. And in large corporations, we touched on this last time a little bit. Large corporations are a lot more like a bank than they are like a venture capitalist. Venture capital seeks out risk, knowing that many of those risks will be, depletive to their capital ultimately, and that they need one or two to hit it big in order to sort of recapitalize and make a profit. With banks, they are not expecting 8 out of 10 of their bets to go bust. And large corporations are largely have that banking mentality in terms of credit worthiness and how they think about a credit risk in terms of the growth strategy that the organization is trying to address in the market. So I see a lot of great comments coming from our audience. Why don't we start with the macro environment and just looking a little bit at putting boundaries around the macro?
Yeah, so if that's bouncing it back to me, and Jonathan, we'll get to your question here in a moment. So you're thinking the macro environment. I'm not a steepled expert by any stretch of the imagination. You said it so fast, I can barely remember what the letters stand for. And I know what most of them stand for. I just don't know that I can order them quite as quickly as you do. Could you bring that slide back up? Because I think it's something I'm going to actually speak to here over the course of the next few minutes. When you think about the discovery angle being aligned to those early warning topics and the contingency factors that you describe, what you're trying to do there is essentially down select into what are the boundaries of that which I'm looking at or potentially going to invest in, and where are those harder boundaries or the edges, if you will, of what that scope might look like, right? And then you have to ask yourself those filter questions, and the stakeholder issue trends and landscapes of what you're really driving toward, I think, is the key takeaway there. And it makes me wonder, something just hit me, and it kind of takes me back. You and I, within the context of this book, are also kind of going back to some of the Christensen innovation theory stuff that you know so much better than I do, and I'm still learning with it. But when you think about that landscape concept, and then you think to one of the more memorable examples that Clay uses in one of those books around why Intel sent that dev team, was it on the Celeron processor, to Tel Aviv?
Intel Corporation's Celeron development went to Israel because it would have been killed in Santa Clara.
Killed by the corporate immune system. Do you believe that that's why most corporations these days, at least the big ones that have a venture arm to them, that is truly separate from the main way in which they make money today, most likely because those wild ambitions and the things that they're looking at from the full landscape, the discovery angle of this model, because they might get killed by the corporate immune system. Is that kind of what you're driving at, or is
I think that's a valid hypothesis, Derek, is that the sort of riskiest investment perspective, the venture capital, must be less sensitive to macro environmental changes like the recession. And that, by the way, is part one last week, was how does competitive intelligence change and adapt to a recessionary economic environment where growth is not as automatic, or as you can't take growth as much for granted as you did during a growth economy. And I think that, we had a lot of great comments actually from our audience as well on that last week. And I think that your recognition there, Derek, is accurate. Venture capital arms of large corporations are usually independent because they have to see beyond the business cycle. They can't respond like the corporation does, because the corporation has to survive and has shareholders to satisfy, by the way, which often venture capital does not think in terms of satisfying shareholders. The shareholders of venture capital funds, typically, if you're a limited partner in a VC fund, you have an expectation that a portion of your capital is going to be cannibalized in pursuit of the innovation that ultimately will be, logarithmically larger in terms of its return on that capital. So that's a really astute observation, Derek, is discovery where our macro environment has all these uncontrollables like economic recession. You have to create a structure and a mindset like a venture capitalist would, where they're seeing several business cycles ahead, maybe a dozen business cycles ahead. And that allows them to think long term about where the growth will really come, what innovation really looks like. And they don't have that sort of, nothing against bankers, but credit extension mindset, maybe I'll say, to be a little more polite there, where they're just extending credit and they expect to get that credit back plus a reasonable rate of interest on that credit, a couple percentage points, in other words, 5% a year being a pretty darn good return on a debt instrument, as opposed to 50% a year over the course of the next 5 years with something that's higher risk. And Derek, you know more about portfolio management than I ever will, and you know that those are risk appetites that have to be encapsulated into every portfolio. You're never going to experience the kind of growth you want if all you're doing is lending money to someone who's going to pay you back a guaranteed rate of return. You're always going to be outstripped by inflation, as our present circumstances demonstrate.
Mm-hmm. I like Terry's comment here. If you don't isolate your higher risk innovation, mainline corporate business will put a pillow over it and hold it there until it stops moving.
It's well said. That's
that.
Spoken from the voice of experience.
I want to come back to, before we lose it here in the chat, Jonathan Dunnett's question. Do you also view minimum viable products, testable solutions within that umbrella of simulation? What do you think about that, Eric?
Yeah, I think that if you have an MVP which you believe is going to get funded, that's that investment grade part of your conjecture. If you believe that you could get this funded, then a simulation of some kind against the other stakeholders who might win or lose, and by definition, from your perspective, could help or hinder you, that is a great way to test your missing assumptions. And that's something that I think we notice in the war games that we run for. Most of our clients are pretty large corporations who we run war games for. But I think that's the real utility, is you get to see all the things you missed during simulation and hadn't planned for, all the surprises that ultimately will come, but which, if you don't have direct experience in a market, or at least a simulated market, you'll just never see, or you're never likely to see. And that's where a lot of those surprises come from. I think that simulation as the end stage of testing that investment grade conjecture is really the proper place for wargaming. If you think about it sort of as a methodology that has a sequenced role in this type of flow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Suki, you draw something out here that's really, I think, important to acknowledge too, and you did it way simpler than either Johnson brother could do. You liken, I'm just going to read this, discovery, what is inside the box, thinking, or what's available within the confines of that box. I'll interpret it that way too. Optimality, how can I get to the top? And simulation, what is that 360-degree view? She's doing a better job than we did, Eric, in kind of using the shape of those images to work us through the model. When we talked last week, we touched on the tendency of big companies now to separate. In other words, forget the exact example. I think it was Kellogg's was separating. The cereal was going to probably be branded one way, and the snacks was another, and there was the other division. I forget if it was shakes or other things. And when big companies find that they can't innovate fast enough to satisfy the return demands of their shareholders, do you believe that this is going to be a growing trend where they break it all up and they try to either get those separate divisions ready and available for a purchase, when a purchase of the total pie wouldn't be possible? And how might those broken up segments use a model like this to better improve what I heard you say once last week was superiority is a choice. You can make a choice to be superior in the markets in which you compete. And then the whole innovation angle to that too. So I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I'll react to the superiority as a choice first. Superiority is a choice because the superiority criteria is plainly available. You can go and gather the satisfiers, drivers, and disruptors that your market will reward with share. And then you can choose how to posture your offer so that you take share based on that criteria. In a nutshell, that's really all that marketing insights and market research does. Market research is there to give us the superiority criteria of the market and then allow us to make the choices necessary intentionally rather than accidentally. I think that's where strategy comes in. Strategy comes in when you try and make those choices more intentional rather than accidental, in optimality, by the way, and that you ultimately then test that strategy against the reactions that others will have, the influence factors that you're going to have to try and drive. You're going to have to try and influence competitors, for example. And one of the terms I heard describing this really, really appropriately a few years ago was you want to be elusive to partners and elusive to competitors. In other words, you want partners to see your offer and say, hey, we can add value to that. And competitors to see your offer and say, I don't have to worry about those guys. Because that buys you time. It buys you time when they laugh at you and tell you that your offer is silly or not good enough or too bold. Then those are all indications that the incumbents in your market are underestimating your offer's superiority criteria, or rather your offer's ability to align with the market's superiority criteria and therefore take share from them. And so that's a really simple way of thinking about that. What was your first question?
Well, it was around the the breakup of these big conglomerates and the way in which they might use a model like this to optimize, to work through the discovery, optimality, and simulation processes within the newly segmented divisions.
So you can kind of think of it as a portfolio rebalancing. That's actually what I would reflect on Kellogg's reorg having done there is they're rebalancing their portfolio based upon the operating environment that they expect to confront in the years ahead. And that suggests that they have slowly evolved away from being the company that they were, that investors ultimately put their capital behind. And now they have something different. And they should actually reflect that through the legal entities that are in the market that ultimately might get disposed of. There might be a liquidity event around one or more of those legal entities on the part of the shareholders. And ultimately those shareholders would then have a liquid amount of capital that comes out of that transaction to reinvest elsewhere, perhaps back into the new company that's more aligned with their investment criteria. And I think that's a really great way for old established companies to remain at least somewhat vital and innovative, is actually thinking about how the market and their shareholders frankly see them, and then reflecting that in terms of the legal ownership of the business, or businesses rather, in the case of Kellogg's sort of tripartite split.
What was the cereal you used to eat way back in the day? Was Fruity Pebbles where you'd grab it by the box and the mixing bowl? Was that a Kellogg's product, or am I thinking that was somebody else?
I don't remember who made it, but I think it was Fruity Pebbles, and I'd grab a mixing bowl and a very large spoon and plop myself in front of Saturday morning cartoons, and the rest was history.
Indeed.
When I was gone, I was done.
Let her rip. Let her rip. A gallon of milk, a box of cereal, and a mixing bowl. That's all you needed. So going back to this model, and let's have a little history lesson. Given the cost of capital was the conversation a week ago, and now we're talking about innovation and the need to make really wise choices with your bets, particularly in a recessionary environment. I was listening to CNBC early this morning, and this debate is ongoing. Are we in a recession yet? I think it depends on how you look at that. If you look at it through the traditional definition of a recession, this famous professor, Jeremy Siegel from Wharton, was on this morning as I caught him, and he said, yeah, you could argue that we are already in a mild recession, but it's bound to get a lot worse, was his professional opinion. Somebody that's very touted as an expert. Going back to 2006, when you saw how the intelligence world could benefit from Clay Christensen's thinking around innovation theory, why was that important to you? And why do you think it should be important to our listeners even more now?
Yeah, so this will probably be my last little remark before we switch to unspeakable. And so, by the way, allow me, I'm going to stop this share and I'm going to feature the Poe app here as a spotlight for just a second. I see we have how many Poe apps left? It's on screen in front of me. We've got 13 Poe app codes left. I'm going to teach you guys something here before we do that. And that is, if you don't have the Poe app mobile app yet, go download it and attach it to your crypto wallet. Hit Mint, scan QR code, which I am now doing. And it's going to take me to a proof of humanity test where I can now prove that I'm a human and redeem my Poe app. So 106, dark blue, dark green, dark blue, purple, blue. I'm probably training the botnets, by the way, while I'm doing this. So forgive me. And oh my gosh. And I'm done. So I got my Poe app. I hope you all do the same. I'm the third of those 15. Please do that while we're talking here before we switch to unspeakable. And if you haven't registered yet, go get on the bridge and you can join the second half of this conversation when we turn us over to the interlocutors. Normally, it's not Derek and I, by the way, doing this, but we had a cancellation last week. And we thought, boy, we're going to take the 5th of July off anyhow. Let's have a nice little recessionary competitive intelligence conversation here last week and this week. So Clay Christensen explained in his seminal book, Seeing What's Next, which was sort of what happened after he did the Innovator's Solution with, what's-his-face, Michael Rayner. And this emerged as sort of, if you had 3 areas that you should focus your planning on, scanning the external operating environment, it should be on these 3 things. And what struck me about this was when I read this in 2004, I guess when the book came out, it struck me that these are kits, basically. This is what the kits protocol is there to do. The kits protocol just says this in really, really much more abstract and geeky nomenclature that intelligence nerds will be drawn to, and strategy people will say, boy, I'm not sure I get it. So in 2005, when the opportunity came up to chair the SCIP conference the following year, I said, I'll do it on one condition, is that I can get Clay Christensen to be our keynote. And they agreed. I got to spend a few days with him explaining competitive intelligence to Clay Christensen. And he's like, where have you guys been all my life? You know, you guys are my tribe. I mean, I should know about you. I said, we're the nerds. That's why you don't know about us. We're too nerdy. We don't get out much. We sit around and talk about key intelligence topics and questions and, all that sort of nerdy stuff. And then you're out there with CEOs explaining this to them. So help us, Clay, would you? Would you help us figure out how to be cool, and cool enough at least to, get inside the C-suite once or twice? And so that's what really stood out to me about this was predicting the outcome of competitive battles, lower left-hand box. That is simulation. That is wargaming. In it, if you boil it down to one word, that's what war games do. Strategic choices influencing success. Making choices as opposed to decisions implies that you're making sacrifices of suboptimal alternatives in order to pick the one that's best for you. And that feels a whole lot like what strategic decisions and issues does in the kits world. And then signals of change felt like a little better way to explain the macro environment early warning subject matter. And I think that's the thing that my conversation with Jan in 2015 yielded was, Jan, would you mind if I reinterpret kits as control factors instead, so that we are a little less abstract and we can help people understand that these are just domains of control, that they have to program a little differently from one another. And if that's the way to suggest it, the word reconnaissance comes up a lot in the last couple of decades for me, because reconnaissance implies that anyone can do it. Anyone in an organization can perform light reconnaissance work. You don't have to be an intelligence nerd to do it, in other words. And I think that's something that we're going to see intensify in the years ahead, is you're going to see more of that moving across the organization, that you have many, many, many more people participating in the intelligence mission, probably never using the word intelligence. So let you respond to that. Kurt Hallbeck and Terry Thiel, I'm going to upgrade you guys to the panel here while we're getting going. Kurt, you're number one. Terry, you're number two. We may have time for a third interlocutor here as well. But Derek, why don't you take us home as I cut the live stream and get those guys promoted?
Yeah, I know. In case you're just tuning in, Eric and I are working on a book, that we're going to call The Missionary and the Mercenary, and that is really coming to life in our weekly jam sessions about these chapters. How, Eric, I think it's fair to say, our belief is that our contribution to the field might be in way of how we align that more classical kit infrastructure with a new model around control factors that drives to alignment of innovation theory and superiority analysis and a number of other things that can actually help businesses and help them make superiority be a choice. So I think that's all I have to add, and it's still an evolving mindset for me. Suki didn't get her POAP. What are we going to do about that, team?
Suki, you got to be quicker on the draw, sister.
You can have mine.
I suppose you could transfer your POAP to her. You just need to tell your wallet where to send it. Did you get your POAP though, Derek?
I didn't.
Because maybe you don't have one to give.
Maybe I don't have one to give, and I'm giving away things that aren't mine to give. I kind of see it as like gifting airline miles. Like that's a possibility too. Can't I just gift my POAP to Suki?
So we're going to say goodbye to the live streamers, folks. Thanks for joining us. Das vidania, Rossiska Sket Robotov. We'll see you next